The story begins with a general wake-up call being announced throughout the entire military camp. The main character, Encrid, did not wake up due to the signal given. One of the soldiers found bugs in his boots and started screaming throughout the room. This cry from a fellow soldier was able to wake up the main character. After a series of mishaps, Encrid was demoted to the position of commander of a detachment of these worthless soldiers. Encrid had no particular experience or abilities, but he managed to get into this position through endless training. In one of the battles of that terrible day, he came face to face with a knight. However, the enemy was much stronger than the main character, and was therefore able to knock him to the ground. When Encrid managed to push the knight back for a few moments, he lost the sword from his hands. The knight swung at Encrid and dealt him a fatal blow to the chest. The protagonist sincerely hoped that he could become an outstanding knight through his diligent training. However, his dreams were not destined to come true, because they had just spilled onto the ground as scarlet blood. The young man didn't even imagine that he would die such a miserable death. After he finally lost consciousness, he woke up again in his bed. In addition to the general awakening, he was awakened by the sound of a colleague who had bugs in his shoes. It was unclear why this moment was repeated for the second day in a row. Deciding that it was a dream, Encrid followed the same route to the battlefield. Suddenly, the tip of a sword appeared behind him, which he failed to notice. The enemy dealt the young man a serious blow and cut off his head. This day was repeated 2 more times, and it began with a general rise of personnel. However, during the ascent, Encrid was no longer asleep and was thinking about how the enemy was stabbing him in the neck. And now the tip of the sword flashes before the hero's eyes for the 17th time. This sword, according to the studied scenario, brings death to Encrid for the 17th time. Before each such death, the hero begins to regret that he did not swing his sword at the knight with more force. Death kept telling the young man that he was not able to overcome this wall. Morning came again, and fellow soldier Ram noted the protagonist's early rise. Encrid told his comrade that he had bugs in his boots. That boot turned over and a fly actually fell out of it. This time Ram got angry at the commander for his bad jokes. The main character admitted that he only saw the beetles crawling into his boots. This is the 18th time he has seen these dead insects. He had no idea how many more times he would go through this day, and whether he would be able to prevent his end. Since childhood, the main character has trained with a sword. His teacher was a former mercenary soldier who ended up in his village quite by accident. The coach assured his student that with his current skills he would definitely be able to become a knight. It was then that young Encrid began to dream of becoming a knight. He wanted to become a knight who could single-handedly take on 1,000 and turn the tide of battle. Then this man who ends the war, people will call him the Knight of the End. 2 servicemen were sitting and drinking beer. They laughed at Encrid, who dreams of becoming a knight. They believed that the young man was not even fit to be a mercenary with his low talents. Encrid himself believed that it was too early for him to give up just because of one mistake. Sooner or later, his hard work will definitely pay off. He believed that with time and effort, he could overcome anything. He was ready to fight even the largest monsters of these places. Once he gained some experience, he was able to earn recognition from those around him for his strength and endurance. However, this firm hope was shattered into small pieces in an instant. One child from the village where he often stayed challenged him to a duel. The boy said that the uncle he fought with was a real weakling. Encrid was offended that he had trained for more than 10 years, rubbing his hands raw, and turned out to be so pathetic in front of an ordinary boy. That 12-year-old boy first picked up a sword only 6 months ago. That is why the main character believed that all his training was in vain. He was going crazy just from the thought that nothing could be done about his strength and endurance. After this incident, he never let go of his sword day or night. He slept and ate several times less than the others so that he could train as hard as he could in his free time. With training, Encrid can become, if not a knight, then at least an experienced soldier. 3 years after that incident, the hero became the commander of a second-rate squad. He wasn't happy about it, but it was better to be an ordinary soldier than a wandering mercenary. He turned to his subordinate Jackson and asked him to take over for him today. After agreeing, Ram approached Encrid and began gossiping about Jackson. The hero turned to Rem, and he immediately thought that they wanted to dump some of the work on him too. However, the protagonist asked his comrade to teach him some exercises of the heart of the beast. The man insisted that there was no need to start training, since Encrid had given up last time. The battle between Norelia and Aspen began again, and Encrid had once died in this battle. The hero came back to life and now lives that day over and over again. Despite his daily training, he still cannot lay his eyes on the sharp sword that would bring him death. Every new day, the main character believed that today everything would end, and he would be able to avoid death. He was on this battlefield for the 21st time. Through such numerous attempts to survive, Encrid was able to learn everything. Now he can dodge the spear behind him, then the blow from the guy behind him. He even remembered that one of the members of his squad, whose name was Vel, might soon die. However, with his hasty actions, he managed to save this desperate fighter from death. When Vel was attacked twice, Encrid cut off the knight's head. The main character's first goal for today has been completed. All that remains is to defeat the main deadly knight. Every day today ended with this fighter, in whose eyes there was real horror. When almost all the knights fell to the ground, Encrid had to meet with that killer. The knight had plunged his sword into his neck exactly 21 times, but today things were to be different. The hero recalled his training with Rem, who taught him to avoid any danger. Then Ram swung an axe at the protagonist and said that he would close his eyes when he detected the blow. With his eyes closed, Encred will quickly die on the battlefield. Rem advised the young man to be braver and not to panic when faced with any blow. And then that terrible knight lunged forward and struck the main character. Encred didn't close his eyes and was able to detect the tip of the sword. The coach advised him to become a beast that is not afraid of death. When the sword was close to the hero's neck, he managed to maneuver and step aside. At that moment, his heart began to beat like that of a wild animal running away from danger. Encred deftly stepped to the side and left the armed knight behind him. Suddenly, a sharp sword appeared in front of the main character's face again. He failed to successfully perform the maneuver again and his neck was severed. Encred clenched his teeth in fear and blood spurted from his throat. Death told Encred that he was trapped in this never-ending day. She suggested that Encred get into the boat and accept his weakness in order to sleep forever. According to Death, the protagonist will never achieve what he dreams of. After these words, the main character excitedly said that death will not happen. A new day dawned, and a general awakening of personnel was also carried out. Fellow soldier Ram said again that the commander woke up earlier than usual today. Encred was determined to fight for the 22nd time, since he had managed to dodge his opponent's sword the previous day. For the 33rd time, the protagonist continued to dodge the first blow with the sword, but stupidly missed the second. He could brilliantly dodge the sword before it reached him. However, at the next moment, the second blow dealt him mortal damage. Each time, Encred couldn't understand how the knight managed to hit him so quickly. Only this time, while awaiting death, Encred remembered his pendant. During his time as a mercenary, he took on several orders to destroy monsters. Encred came across a random village where they plaintively asked him for help, and he couldn't refuse. The reason he decided to help people was his dream of becoming a knight and protecting the weak. The village was so poor that they could offer nothing substantial in gratitude. This is how Encred came to have an amulet that would protect him from any danger. For him it was a ridiculous reward, but the elder said that the amulet would reward him with what he so desperately prayed for. At the moment of death, the hero thought that it was the amulet that made today repeat itself over and over again in order to achieve its goals. In the last seconds of Encred's life, the knight said that he would be merciful to him and would deal the final blow so that he would not suffer. After the death of the main character, a new day dawned and a general uprising took place. This time the main character played a joke on his colleague and said that he put bugs in his boot. After that, he asked Rem to teach him the skills of the beast's heart. The man agreed, and together with the main character they went to another training session. Rem struck Encred with an axe, but he skillfully dodged it. The coach praised his student for being able to train his brave heart. The main character learned the feeling of courage from death itself. Encred suggested to the coach to have another sparring session. If the main character doesn't learn to strike back now, he will continue to die at the hands of the knight. Rem didn't like the fact that his commander was simply dodging his attacks. The only sword technique Encred currently possesses is the sword technique of the mercenary Wallen. It was an anomalous technique created by a mercenary known as Wallen. Ram told the student that his lower body was too weak. Among what the main character has, this is the most worthy technique. In the final sparring session, he managed to make a perfect lunge and strike Rem with his sword. He immediately flew to the side and dropped his sword. The hero realized that for a moment he was able to imitate the knight's blow. A colleague commented that there should be some blood from this technique. He explained that this most worthy blow had to be delivered with a little pressure that would draw blood. According to him, the protagonist's hands should have started bleeding long ago. Ram also noted that Encred doubts himself too much. The young man didn't know what to do or how to block that deadly attack. Ram insisted that Encred needed to increase his confidence in himself and his actions. This will teach him not to lose his grip on the sword and to move only forward. Only now did the main character understand the difference between his blow and that knight's blow. He realized that in a fight with a knight he simply had no confidence in his weapon. From now on he must strike with the intent to kill the enemy. The protagonist lunged forward again, and his sword immediately flew upward due to Rem's counterattack. By taking a step forward or just a quarter step, Encred will still move forward towards his dream. All the following days he could not resist the knight's fatal blow. Even on the 111th day, the knight dealt the final blow with the words that it was for mercy. On the 123rd day, the knight again dealt the protagonist a fatal blow with words of mercy. Finally, on the 124th day during training, Encred's hands began to bleed. When he realized that he had achieved the result, he laughed like crazy. However, in the actual fight, his first attempt at a practice strike failed. But this time everything was successful right up until the moment the two swords touched. The knight threw Encred to the ground to deal him the final blow of mercy. Before his death, the main character said that he would kill this knight tomorrow, but he did not agree with this. It was a new morning of the same day when Encred told his comrade about the bugs. Rem was grateful for this, and Encred asked him to take on some of his duties as a token of gratitude. The colleague did not understand why the commander was ordering him in such a familiar voice. While preparing for battle, The hero asked his big-eyed subordinate to get him armor, a shield, and a dagger. He said he would pay for them a little later, but he clearly didn't like it. Ram told his comrade that the commander had not been so impudent with his subordinates before, and he also said that you, the most handsome and cool viewer on YouTube, would subscribe to the channel today and definitely leave a comment. But it seems to me that you won't do it. Enjoy watching, my handsome man. One of the fighters said that previously the commander was not like this, only because he had to bear the bulk of the responsibilities of the entire detachment. Usually the main character was not as tense as he is now. Encurd wanted to get to the result as quickly as possible, because every time he dies he feels incredible pain. The young man was afraid to imagine what would happen if he did not find a way to avoid the blow and survive. Now he was stronger than before, and this brought him some joy. The hero could not agree with the idea of retreating from his goal, because he must overcome any difficulties. Now his target is an impenetrable wall in the form of a dangerous knight. During his training, he tried to learn how to strike back immediately after blocking a knight's blow. In addition to practicing with Ram, he practiced his swing on the tree. He received the necessary armor from Big Eyes and, together with his squad, went to the battlefield. Soon the two opposing armies met face to face. Encrid is able to survive this battle thanks to three things. His survival was a combination of preparation, luck, and incredible calm. On the 46th day, his shoulder was broken by a spiked mace. On the 47th day, he turned to avoid a mace, but someone smashed his head. On the 71st day, one of the soldiers cut off his leg, so he could do nothing with the knight. On the 89th day, his head was split open by someone throwing an axe. If he leaves this enemy alive, he will interfere with his battle with the main knight. He had been training and throwing weapons for countless days, so it was not a difficult task for him. With one easy swing, he threw his weapon and killed the attacker. After all his actions, his colleague Vel ends up right behind him. While the protagonist had time, he used his shield to save Vel from the attack. The moment of meeting the impenetrable wall has arrived. The knight was an ordinary fighter, who also had fear in his eyes. Encrid managed to escape from the massacre and approach the knight. The knight had nothing in his defense except a long ball. The main character was able to parry all of the knight's first blows with his shield. However, dodging and hitting by themselves do not give him any chance of winning. The knight was an ordinary soldier, but even so, he was strong almost on the level of a gifted fighter. The knight did not understand the enemy's behavior, because at first he attacked him, but instead blocked the blow. The knight lacks experience in real combat, so he is easily surprised. Encrid picked up a pile of earth with his foot and threw it at the knight. The earth hit the enemy right in the face and stopped him in his actions for a while. As he cleared the ground, the protagonist took advantage of the moment and swung the ball at him. However, the knight was fast and managed to instantly maneuver for a further attack. A sharp sword passed close to the protagonist's neck, and he managed to dodge it. The hero stepped aside a few meters and found himself behind the knight. Only at that moment did the hero realize that he knew absolutely everything about this blow. After a few blows, he managed to cut his opponent's sword into pieces. Suddenly, a sharp arrow flew over the heads of the fighters. The knight stood without a weapon and simply looked at Encrid with fear. At that moment, the main character realized that he had won this fight. Most of the fighters fell dead on the ground, and only the main character himself remained alive. The arrow that was flying towards the lead knight and Encrid was broken into two pieces in flight. Without thinking twice, Encrid plunged his sharp sword into the knight's chest and drew blood from it. Rem rushed to help and wanted to kill this worthless claw, but there was nothing to help with, since the main knight was impaled on Encrid's sword. He didn't expect that his life would end from this stupid blow. The protagonist swung his sword at the knight and with words of mercy dealt him the final blow. With one easy movement, he cut the head from the knight's shoulders. After many days, he finally managed to break through this wall. Suddenly, a huge creature with frog legs appeared in sight. It threw the main character several meters and knocked him to the ground. The rest of Encard's crew became alarmed at the appearance of this creature. Judging by its appearance, the creature belonged to the frog people. The creature told Encrid that it had put great effort into raising this knight. It couldn't believe that someone like a weak fighter could defeat it. He grabbed his weapon and told the protagonist that he would die right now. However, fellow soldier Ram got ahead of the frog and struck back. It was not easy for the frog to repel the blows of the brave Ram. At this time, an armed knight appeared over the overturned Encrid. Luckily, a member of Encrid's squad was behind him and cut the knight's head off. Rem didn't know how to defeat a frog that was 1.5 times bigger than him. Rem said that all the knights had to pass through it before cutting off the head of its commander. The creature was surprised that the commander was that weakling and not Rem. Rem planned to kill the frog with magic or with one precise blow. The creature did not understand why such an experienced fighter was involved in such an insignificant battle. For the sake of his commander, Rem will have to put his life on the line. Realizing that the fighter was ready to do anything, the frog believed that this battle was not worth it. Ram prepared to attack, but the frog simply turned around and walked away. Jackson continued to fight the nearby knights. He easily cut off heads from the shoulders of his enemies. Suddenly, a knight appeared behind him, preparing a deadly attack. But he was instantly killed by his fellow soldier Auden. After this attack, the knight's attacks ceased. Cries of retreat were heard on the battlefield. The main character, not having waited for rescue, lost consciousness and died again. According to Death, he was destined to live only one day. Ancrid won't be able to cope with the walls that will appear in his path. Death believed that the protagonist's fate was one of despair. However, he believed that walls exist to be destroyed. He was quite confident in himself and was determined to achieve success. Death laughed and said that he would look forward to the moment when his eyes finally lost their shine. Morning came and the hero woke up in the local hospital. This place was set up in one of the tents of the military town. A member of the 4th Squad Rams said that the hero slept for 2 whole days. He said that he saved the commander from that damn frog. It was surprising for the hero because after that frog he could not survive. Taking advantage of Encrid's concussion, Rem reminded him that he was his best friend. But the main character said that he never said anything like that they were friends. Rem jumped out of bed and covered Enkidu's mouth. The main character was happy that that endless day was over and a new morning had arrived. A member of the 4th Detachment, Krace, asked the commander to repay him 3 times the amount of his debt. It turned out that it was he who carried Encrid off the battlefield and sent him to the infirmary. The hero found all this strange, because during the battle, Krace, as always, was nowhere to be seen. He became embarrassed and said that he would give a special discount for the sake of the commander. In the evening, a member of the same detachment, Jackson, arrived at the infirmary ward. Encrid was not happy about this meeting and asked the guest to tell him all his news. However, he didn't say anything. He just threw a package of ointment on his bed. Before leaving, he told me not to ask where he got it from and ordered me to apply it twice a day. The hero knew that this ointment, which Jackson had previously used, was an expensive and personal item of the fighter. Later, Auden arrived in the room and immediately began to shed tears over the patient. Encrid did not like this situation and asked his colleague to leave the infirmary. It seemed to him that they visited him in shifts, because before they were all busy with their own affairs. Still, he resigned himself to it and decided that his comrades were simply worried about him. The curtain of the chamber opened and a young man, Ragno, entered. He didn't care what was happening. He was just quietly surprised why the commander was in the infirmary. Without waiting for an answer from the hero, he simply waved his hand and left the room. Besides the main character, there were 2 more soldiers in the ward. One was a platoon commander from another company who was engaging Encrid. From another company, there was a soldier whose name Encrid still does not know. This young man spends all his time alone and is always staring into empty space. Suddenly, a female soldier entered the room and everyone was surprised by her arrival. She had special weapons, protection, and also elf ears were visible. She turned to the sick and asked which of them was the commander of the 4th Detachment. Vergence turned to the girl and asked if she was a fairy. He introduced himself as the commander of the 3rd Platoon of the 2nd Company. The girl reprimanded him for announcing race when meeting senior officers. The man realized what was happening and asked the lady for forgiveness. Encrid announced that he was the commander of the 4th Squad, 4th Platoon, 4th Company. The female commander noted that he works well with difficult squad members, and she also expects his assistance in this. She wanted to leave the infirmary, but at the last minute she asked the strange guy his name. He hesitantly and excitedly said that his name was Krang. The main character noticed that the guy's behavior in front of the company commander was simply terrible. The fairy glanced at the young man and left the infirmary. Most of the pain is gone, and now Encrid can put strength into his body and begin training. He began preparing for training, and Vergens asked about his plans. The man believed that he did not need training, because he would always be a low-ranking soldier. The main character needed to remember the last battle and one of the most useful methods. He didn't think it was a good idea to focus on just one thing, and he should learn other types of attacks. In his opinion, all of Rem's attacks with an axe were lethal, and he should learn to wield a sword. Suddenly, a voice from the outside informed him that he was working hard. It turned out that Krang was sitting behind him, watching his training. Encrid said he spends most of his time here to train his grip strength. The young man didn't understand why his colleague was training, but he said so as not to screw up. According to Krang, Encrid wanted to become someone while preserving his life. The hero was afraid to voice his desires, because before people always burst into laughter from what they heard. Despite this, he never stopped pursuing his dream. He grabbed his sword and said that he was going to become an outstanding knight. Krang was surprised by what he heard and didn't laugh at all. It was the first time the main character saw someone who didn't laugh after his words. The young man stood up and, as he left, said that he now understood what he needed to do to be successful. He asked the commander of the 4th Squad to remember his name when he became a knight. A new day dawned and the musicians sang songs about the battle hero Cypriot. For the first time, Encrid took a short, leisurely stroll instead of going to the training area and saw Jackson. He asked the commander how he was feeling, but fortunately the medicine was working well. As a token of gratitude, Jackson asked Encrid to hurry and return to the infirmary. Oddly enough, before going to bed, Krang wished Encrid good night. Morning came, and the hero woke up from the cries of the battle hero Cypriot. For the 2nd day in a row, Vergens said that they had not been fed for a long time. Encrid went for a walk and met Jackson, who inquired about his injuries. Repeating the same thing for the 2nd day, Jackson ordered the commander to return to the infirmary. Only then did the main character realize that this day was stuck in infinity and was repeating itself over and over again. He remembered the words of death, which told him that another wall was waiting for him that would stop him. Encred realized that he had died in his sleep and had not noticed it. He felt like real trash, because he died more hopelessly than when he received sword blows. But this made him even more determined to face difficulties. Before going to bed, Encred thought about how the enemy had to get through all the defenses to get to the infirmary, and that only knights could do that. It is unlikely but quite possible that the assassin is hiding among his fellow soldiers. The assassin must be professional in his stealth assassinations, and is probably the fairy commander. The hero assumed that the fairy's quiet and light step was ideal for stealth assassinations. The reason she came that day was to gather information about her fellow soldiers. There is only one entrance to the infirmary, and Encred was going to watch it for a while to prevent himself and his fellow wardmates from being killed. He tried to keep his eyes open to wait for the assassin to arrive. Encred didn't notice the moment when a poisonous dart hit his neck. He also didn't notice how the killer entered the infirmary. Because of the poison dart, he could not move or speak. He finally understood why he died last night. He looked back and saw that Virgins had also died from the poison dart. However, Krang was still alive, but there was a killer standing near him. The assassin raised his sword over the young man's body and plunged it into his chest. It turned out that the assassin does not work alone, but in company with other killers. In one of the assassins, Encred recognized the fairy girl, the company commander. A new one began, which began with cries about Cyprus. The young people continued to play musical instruments and sing praises to the hero of the battle. This morning was repeated for the third time in a row. Encred didn't close his eyes that night, but he still couldn't sense the presence of a stranger. Even if he manages to stop the assassins, he will have to immediately face the fairy commander. The hero was overcome by the same feeling of helplessness that he had a few days ago. But despite this, thanks to a lot of training, it was he who won that battle. He is confident that he can find a way to survive this endless day. He grabbed his sword and headed towards Virgins' bed, but he was mistaken in thinking that the assassins had already infiltrated the base by this time. Virgins was angry about what was happening, and he treated the 4th squad leader as a low-level soldier. He shouted at the top of his lungs and chased Encred out of the infirmary. Their cry brought Krang, who was disappointed with the quarrels here. The hero was sure that the killer's target was Krang, because they were keeping a close eye on him. He became curious about who Krang really was, as he was acting quite strangely. Encred didn't want to bother a person if he didn't want to talk about himself. He won't act like those crazy fighters. But he still decided to ask that question, because thanks to Krang, he was drawn into the murder. He approached his colleague and asked who he really was. Beads of sweat began to flow from the young man's forehead, and he did not immediately answer the question. The protagonist immediately regretted asking Krang this question and making him nervous. The young man thought for a moment and said that he could not answer the question posed. He explained this by saying that it was too long a story and there wasn't enough time for it. Virgins yelled at the commander of the 4th squad and said that he did not know how to communicate with people. He assumed that Krang was a citizen of another country, just by looking at his mannerisms. He asked the young man which country exactly he was spying for. Krang said with confidence that he had never betrayed and would never betray his kingdom. It was evident in his eyes and the movements of his body and hands. The hero noted that Krang's aura was similar to a real knight's aura. Virgins reprimanded the boy for his rude manners in communicating with a superior. However, Encred concluded that Krang was not a knight, because he was also helpless before the killers. However, he is definitely hiding something behind his personality. Night fell and all the sick went to bed. The protagonist discovered an open curtain in the infirmary, thanks to which all the killers can instantly kill those lying down. He grabbed his sword and got out of bed to guard the room. Virgins couldn't understand what his colleague was doing instead of going to bed. He explained that murderers would soon burst into their room and asked Virgins for cooperation. Virgins rolled over onto his other side and said that Encred had gone completely crazy. However, the hero expected exactly this reaction, that he would have to work alone. Suddenly, a weapon flew in from outside and cut the commander's throat. Everything happened instantly, and now the killer had already defeated Virgins. The next moment, he pinned Krang to the bed and plunged a sharp sword into his chest. For the 4th time, the morning began with the name of Cypriot. With no evidence of the murders, Encred decided to report everything to his superiors in order to get reinforcements. When he was refused, he decided to go it alone and predict when the killers would come. He wanted to scream before the killers arrived, but at that very moment he received a sharp wound to the throat. The killers immediately flew into the tent and dealt with everyone present in a matter of seconds. The next day, the protagonist realized that he could not get help from anyone, and he had to catch the killers by surprise before they did anything. But he could not fight an enemy he could not see, and who killed 3 sick people in a second. While he is unable to even see them, the killers see everything. Until he can avoid their poisoned darts, he will die without the ability to do anything. Songs about the battle hero Cypriot started the day again. It was the 20th morning when the protagonist could do nothing. First, he decided to come up with a way to dodge the poisoned darts. Encred decided to turn to Jackson for advice to help him avoid attacks. Jackson never openly participated in battles on the battlefield, but he always managed to emerge victorious from them. He went to training, where he asked Ram why Jackson was called a perverted wildcat. Rem responded that Jackson was a dirty pervert. He never fights the enemy directly, but prefers to strike from behind and run. It is his actions that remind everyone of a cunning, perverted wildcat. When the protagonist approached Jackson, he was sure that he would help him overcome the killers with ease. However, he cannot take it with him into battle because he does not have enough authority. As much as he wouldn't like to, he has to climb this wall himself. Encred turned to Jackson and asked him what he would do to prevent a backstab. In his future battles, he wanted to take on Jackson's role. The young man thought for a moment and said that no one had ever survived his ambush. Jackson said that such ambushes and successful attacks require eyes in the back of your head. The main character thought that these were all jokes, but he proved him wrong. Jackson informed Encred that there was a cart behind the tents. Thanks to the sound, the young man realized that the cart was about to fall apart. The next moment, the cart actually jumped up and lost all its wheels. The main character asked his friend how he managed to predict this. He said that thanks to his perfect hearing, he heard the creaking of the cart's axle as it rushed along. When you hear what's going on around you, you can predict what will happen next. This was quite difficult for the main character, because he didn't even hear the cart pull up to the backyard. Jackson advised the commander to listen to the sounds of the surrounding world and focus his attention on them. Before, Encred thought that Jackson was too lazy to even answer normally, but now he explained everything quite well. He explained that he was really too lazy to say anything, but it was better to explain everything once than to have Encred follow him around. Lately, Jackson has been feeling like his commander will stop at nothing. Night fell and all the sick went back to sleep in the infirmary. Now the main character stood in front of the wall in the form of faceless death. He was sure that he could survive if he could feel her sounds. However, the killer was extremely quiet, and the sound of his steps was not heard by Encred's ear. While waiting for the killer, the hero did not notice how a poisonous dart flew into his neck. The same morning came again, and Encred did not know what to do in this situation. He hadn't moved a single step in the past day, but fortunately his body clearly remembered all his actions. Jackson explained to him that a lot of information could be gleaned from sound alone, such as the location of a target. Once Encred can detect subtle, distant sounds, his ears will become a second pair of eyes. Jackson snapped his fingers and said that the sound spread in all directions, no matter how quiet it was. Among thousands of chaotic sound waves, the main character needs to select just one. The hero went to training and tried to learn to distinguish between quiet and loud sounds. He practiced this exercise on the squad flags, which sounded like one big flag. Suddenly, among 100 sounds, he was able to recognize the rather familiar steps of Krang. Krang asked his colleague why he needed these trainings. The main character justified himself by saying that he was just sitting in the fresh air, and it didn't look like training at all. However, Krang knew that the commander would not waste time. That same evening, a poisonous dart flew into the protagonist's neck again. After this, the killer woke up Krang and plunged a sharp sword into his chest. Several days passed in this way, and the hero did not know how to overcome this wall. During these few days, he still had not learned to hear the sounds of approaching death. Encred went back to training to try again and again. When Krang was already close to the main character, he opened his eyes and looked at him. Krang was surprised that his comrade heard that it was he who was coming, since he had been sneaking as quietly as possible. The young man suggested that the hero was training his attentiveness with his eyes closed. He praised this training and said that the commander was not wasting his time. But all the efforts of the main character brought some success. When he was attacked at night, he was able to maneuver and escape the attack. With his actions, he knocked the killer to the floor and found himself in an active stance. For the first time, he looked into the eyes of the faceless death that wore the face of a knight. The killer told the protagonist that he was a rat who had ruined everything. Encred realized that this knight was not as good in battle as that death-obsessed knight. Encred was troubled by the fact that Vergence was already dead by this point. However, Crank managed to jump out of bed and grab his weapon. The main character couldn't let his guard down, because this man is, after all, an experienced killer. The killer struck the hero with his sword and cut his chest. The young man flew back but still tried to stay on his feet. A fairy appeared in the tent, who was the company commander. The main character continued the attack and tried to strike the girl first. The fairy became visibly alarmed when she saw Encred's weapon flying straight at her. The knight told the hero that all this time he had a guard in the form of a thin girl. Without thinking twice, the knight launched a multitude of poison needles towards the main character. Luckily, all the darts missed Encred without damaging him. The young man Krang understood that all the launched needles were flying right at him. The company commander maneuvered, and with the help of a push from Encred, rushed towards Krang. She knocked down all the flying darts with her body and saved Krang. It was up until this moment that the main character thought that the girl was in cahoots with the killer. Be that as it may, now Encred has one chance to change this day. He rushed at the knight with a knife and knocked him to the floor. When the killer realized that he was not destined to emerge from the battle victorious, he left the tent. Encred, Krang, and the fairy company commander remained in the tent. The young man told the main character that the killer had most likely come for his soul. Ancred said that no one would hire an assassin to convince a worthless officer like him or Vergence. The fairy agreed that the killer had come here for Krang. The girl took out a sharp sword, and the main character did the same, because he thought that she would attack him now. Krang calmed the situation, turned to the fairy and told her about one request. He asked the company commander to make sure there were no deaths today. To Krang's surprise, the fairy bowed to him and fulfilled his request. Krang asked the company commander what was wrong with Vergence, and she had an antidote. Now Krang was thinking about the disorder in the infirmary, which could let people know that a killer had visited them. The protagonist did not understand why it was important that there were no traces in the infirmary. He came up with a simple solution, and within minutes a fire broke out in the infirmary. All the soldiers ran out of their tents and began to put out the fire. One of the soldiers discovered 2 survivors in the form of Ancred and Vergence. Now all traces of the assassin's appearance were swept away. The military personnel will deal with the consequences of the fire in the near future. Krang went into the forest with the company commander, where she informed him that he could have easily died if not for Ancred. The girl suggested that it was because of the main character that Krang changed his mind about his actions. The young man explained that he tried to avoid this, but he failed. Coming out into the sun, Krang reported into the void that they should soon meet Ancred under appropriate conditions. The protagonist survived a silent death and woke up in a new day. Now he feels the presence of almost everything around him, but he could not notice that fairy. He still has a lot to learn when he returns to the squad. Vergence asked his colleague why he pulled him out of the fire. Ancred didn't understand why he was picking on him for saving him. He explained to the man that they were comrades and no other reason was needed for rescue. Vergence believed that he shouldn't have saved him after everything he had thrown at him. The main character announced that he was returning to his squad right now. Vergence secretly told his comrade that he shouldn't return to the squad today, because the mood there was pretty bad. Rumors spread throughout the camp that the entire camp was cursed. At this time, Ragnar asked his colleagues not to joke about the rumors. When Rem continued his jokes, Ragnar couldn't resist and rushed at him with his fists. The people around shouted throughout the street that it was time to flee from the brawl of gifted fighters. Rem grabbed an axe and began to threaten to kill Ragnar. He grabbed a sharp sword and wanted to chop Rem into pieces. Their squad leader Ancred arrived at the scene of the brawl. The young man believed that these crazy soldiers were his personal curse. He took all possible steps to stop the quarrel between 2 colleagues. 4 days have passed since the main character returned to the squad. This morning Jackson came to visit him and woke him up. Jackson wanted to quietly enter the room and did not plan to wake and cried. Ancred thanked Jackson for the lift, as he was just about to go to training. Jackson noted the progress in Ancred's hearing training, which he had only recently begun. He told the protagonist that one day this would save him from death. As winter approaches, battles become less and less frequent. The main character tried to use all his free time as usefully as possible. When he went to the camp, he met his fellow soldier. The man also worked out and praised the main character's fitness. He told Ancred that a trained body is the most powerful weapon. According to him, the body can be able to withstand a frog's blow. He advised the hero to continue working out and gaining weight. The hero thought he was in great physical shape, but the other guy was just over-muscled. At this time in the squad, Rem kicked Ragnar because he did not prepare breakfast. The young man flew back to the sword and immediately grabbed it. Rem armed himself with his only axe to repel the madman's attack. The commander of their detachment arrived in the room in company with Auden. Rem told the commander that Ragnar was trying to starve them to death. Ancred told Ragnar to start cooking, and he immediately agreed. Rem believed that the quarrel happened out of nowhere, since the young man was going to go cook anyway. The hero realized that his subordinates were just bored, and that was why they were picking fights for no reason. Rem said that his hands were itching to not fight, so Ancred suggested that he go sparring. During one of the blows, Rem's leg hit the main character's side. The man told the commander to take the blow better. Ancred knew he needed to keep as calm as possible with the help of the beast's heart. Also in this training, he tried to use his hearing to block his opponent's punches. This time he managed to make a perfect lunge that would have killed a real opponent. Rem maneuvered and caught Ancred's sharp sword with his axe. After that, he grabbed the main character and threw him to the ground. He told the hero that he expected much more from him, because recently he had become much better at it. The same attack had already become boring for Rem, and he demanded something new from his student. The main character realized that thanks to numerous trainings he was able to become different. In order to improve, he is able to repeat everything hundreds and thousands of times. He offered to spar with Rem again so that he could give him what he deserved. Rem thought that Ancred didn't have enough skills to fight, but his gaze clearly contained danger. Suddenly, in the middle of training, it started raining from the sky and the fighters went into the tent. Crace didn't like that he had to cancel fights because of the rain. He was ready to believe that their camp was really cursed. The protagonist pretended not to know anything about the rumors, and he tried to tell him everything. Ancred remembered that Vergence had spoken of something similar earlier. Crace blamed the fire, rain, and heavy losses on this curse. He hadn't previously thought that the camp was actually cursed, but the capricious weather only added fuel to the fire. Ancred informed everyone that command would not ignore something like this. The young man asked the hero why he was standing at the entrance. He said that he trains his senses, especially his hearing. Rem didn't understand why Encrid was doing useless things. Jackson thought it was a good way to exercise, since there were a lot of extra sounds outside due to the rain. Because of the quarrel in the ward, the main character did not hear the sounds coming from the street. At this time, a meeting of commanders was taking place in the headquarters tent. The issue of filling the gaps in the reconnaissance detachment was discussed at the meeting. The fairy girl made a proposal to the commander of the 4th detachment of the 4th company. However, the chief commander believed that that stupid guy would only hinder the scouts. The female commander believed that Encrid could bring unexpected results. The next day, she called the protagonist to her tent. She told him that the command had agreed to send him to the reconnaissance detachment to carry out a combat mission. When Crace learned that the commander was being taken on a campaign, he assumed that Encrid had angered the fairy. Rem took an axe in his hands and told the hero that he could help him get out of this mess. The main character will not allow himself to raise an axe against a superior in rank. Auden sat against the wall again with tears in his eyes, and asked the Lord why he was taking his commander away from him. Earlier, he called the main character and offered to send himself instead of him. Encrid said he would easily send others, but not him. Jackson said the commander would have to scout out the tall grass fields. He advised paying attention to changes in the noise of the grass, which is the first step in detecting an ambush. Ram asked Jackson to shut his mouth because he couldn't teach Encrid anything. The hero was worried that without him, the squad would start a global quarrel, and there would be no one to look after him. In this situation, even he agrees that no one is better suited for these fighters than him. After joining the service, due to his lack of skills, he was constantly transferred here and there to fill gaps in the units. The only thing he could do was become the commander of a squad of scum. Rem turned to Encrid in a calm tone and asked him if he was brave or just stupid. Jackson reprimanded Ram for not thanking Encrid for saving him in battle. The protagonist understood that these thugs could not be lost, because compared to them, the loss of Encrid would not greatly affect the fighting force. There is no need for these reflections, because Encrid knows what he is like in terms of abilities. The scout squad and Encrid set out on a reconnaissance mission. On this trip, the hero will be able to spend time training his senses. While he was thinking, someone shouted at him to pull himself together, and he didn't like it. The commander of the reconnaissance squad, Andrew, suggested that if he didn't like something, they could settle the misunderstanding with their fists. Another man in the ranks said that Encrid did not have the strength to grapple with the commander of the reconnaissance squad. The commander turned to the main character and said that his squad exists solely because of the fighters, and he is no good there. The man shouted at his subordinates to smash the skulls of their opponents as soon as they met. Noticing the commander's loudness, Encrid realized that the reconnaissance mission would not be successful. Suddenly, the detachment came across several pairs of someone's footprints. The reconnaissance commander assumed that these were traces of Nu. He suggested to his fellow soldiers to follow these tracks to have some shashlik in the evening. Only the main character knew that Nu moved in groups of at least 20 individuals, and this could be dangerous. One of the scouting party, whose name was Henry, said that their commander was not one of the best people. Henry didn't really bother with his commander, and maybe that's why he immediately became friends with Encrid. Henry explained the basics of hunting, which turned out to be quite useful. The squad spent the entire day searching for non-existent Nu, and the reconnaissance squad's time was wasted. In the morning, they arrived at the designated place they were supposed to inspect. It seemed like it was just a useless field overgrown with giant grass. Naive Andrew was confident that they would be able to cross this field, find the scouts, and take them prisoner. Henry said that their detachment was supposed to conduct reconnaissance only up to the border. Encrid said not to resist what was said, because it was the order of the squad leader. The entire squad, one after another, went deep into the tall grass. Unexpectedly for the main character, Andrew took up the matter seriously and didn't even complain. Henry noted that there was too little animal droppings in this area. According to him, this meant that animals did not live here, but although this place was rich in their food. After walking a few meters, they came across a large predator. It was a large black wildcat that screamed at the sight of people. Encrid immediately told his closest comrades to immediately duck and lie on the ground. Those who did not manage to do this were instantly struck in the forehead by an arrow. It turned out that there was an armed enemy detachment near the reconnaissance detachment. The desperate young men tried to escape from the pursuit, but they were not very successful. The main character did not want to die in this particular place because of such a stupid situation. When he tried to escape from pursuit alone, about 20 knights ran after him. Listening to various sounds, the hero heard the creak of a crossbow and arrows. The instinct he learned from Jackson clearly helps, but without figuring out where exactly the sound was coming from, Encrid went out to several spears. At the same moment, these spears pierced the main character's chest and stomach. The next day, Encrid suggested to Endry that they try to sensibly bypass the ambush, but he was against it. It was clear that the scout squad would never listen to the main character. The hero tried to escape in different ways, but his enemies stopped him every time. Another day, 20 crossbowmen caught him in the east, and he died, riddled with bolts. He decided to go north to avoid the crossbowmen, but he encountered a detachment of spearmen. The enemies did not stop pursuing them, even when Encrid managed to escape from everyone. The knights' uniforms were painted green, as if they were waiting for enemies. The main character did not understand what could be guarded in this large field. After another death, Andrew set his squad to cross the field and take all the enemies prisoner. Only Encrid knew that they would enter the field alive and would not come back out. He assumed that the Aspen warriors were indeed hiding something in this field. He walked back for a second, deciding to forget about this mission so as not to die. But eventually he pulled himself together and decided not to give up. Andrew yelled at Encrid and told him to return to the squad immediately. One of the men asked the main character to endure the antics of their commander. Encrid pushed the man away from him and said that he was not going to play these games anymore. Andrew grabbed his sword when he realized he was refusing to follow direct orders. The hero loudly announced that from now on he would be the only one giving orders. Of all the soldiers, Encrid singled out Andrew as the one who survived the longest. Henry and that annoying man are also the last to die. Especially that man fights as powerfully as he looks. Andrew agreed to give up his command to the hero if he could defeat him in personal combat. Judging by Andrew's stance, the protagonist concluded that he had been properly trained in weapons, and that he was probably the son of a wealthy family. But with skills like his, he clearly lacks experience in battle. But if he were the son of some rich lord, he would not be so eager to curry favor. The hero assumed that he belonged to some noble house in Opal. Andrew didn't understand how Encrid had achieved a command position with his abilities. Andrew shouted to the whole street that he had a mission and he was sticking to it. The protagonist asked the man to close his mouth and prepare for an attack. He grabbed his sword and ran straight towards Encrid. In a normal situation, it would be difficult for the hero to cope with such a capable guy. But here he is, clearly underestimated. Hasty actions lead to inattention, and inattention to loss. The main character was confident that he would be able to defeat Andrew without the help of weapons. The young man tried to deal the hero a powerful blow with his sword, but he managed to brush it off. Encrid immediately counterpunched Andrew in the stomach. He turned blue from pain and began to spit out all the bile. The men from the scout squad were surprised by such a powerful blow. The hero said that from that moment on, the squad would be under his command. However, there were no objections from the reconnaissance detachment fighters. Only Andrew wanted to say something, but he couldn't because of the severe pain in his stomach. This was the first step towards salvation from this endless day. The detachment under Encrid's command went further in search of enemies. Some members of the squad did not understand why they were going deep into the tall grass. On the way, the main character asked Henry what he dreamed about. He said that he would like to marry a beautiful girl with a flower shop to boot. Encrid asked the same question of another man, and he replied that he would not want his child to grow up without a father. The two dreamed of saving up a lot of money and starting their own business. Andrew said that he would fulfill his mother's last wish. His dream and mission is to revive the Gardner house. The protagonist informed everyone in the squad that they needed to put in a little effort to fulfill their wishes alive. With his words, he guided the reconnaissance soldiers on the right path. The hero needed these guys to actively respond to everything that was said. Suddenly, Encrid ordered Henry to shoot an arrow into the void at head level. When he refused, the commander once again insistently asked him to shoot. The arrow flew straight into the head of one of the knights. The scout squad shouted throughout the street that an ambush awaited them too. The protagonist grabbed the sword and ordered Andrew to go after him. The commander believed that in order to gain an advantage, they needed to find the knights first, and suddenly attack them from behind. Andrew was the first to kill one of the knights, plunging his sword into his neck. The heroes must take advantage of the moment of surprise and thin out their ranks as much as possible. Encrid decided to lead Andrew, who skillfully cuts off the heads of knights. Andrew will be followed by his bodyguard, as well as other members of the squad. The main character believed that with the rest of the guys, the chances of winning would increase significantly, since they had already managed to reduce the number of enemies to 8. One of the knights shouted that it was an ambush and they urgently needed reinforcements. The main characters decided to finish off this group of knights right now, without waiting for their reinforcements. The knights came across the fighters first, and all because there was a wild cat in the field. It was when the knight was distracted by the cat that he immediately received a fatal blow from the main character's hand. The knights chased the beast that Encrid had noticed the first time. The enemy discovered the reconnaissance fighters completely by accident. This time they did not notice the scouts' ambush because they were focused on the pursuit. The protagonist thought through his next steps and informed his team that they were moving on. With one loss, there were only 6 scouts left, and even after many cycles, it was not possible to save them all. After some distance, they came across the knights again. The main character struck one of the knights and cut off his head. Thanks to today's repetitions, Encrid knows the number and location of enemy units. The hero was aiming for his squad to use hit-and-run tactics, gradually breaking out of enemy encirclement. The heroes need to turn right to get around the crossbowmen. Andrew was already worn out, and this caused some difficulties for the scout squad. The young people need to get out of the tall grass before the sun sets. Encrid said that they needed to move on, but one of the fighters disagreed with him. He believed that their actions would only get them deeper. Suddenly, Henry became alarmed, seeing something terrible in front of him. A bloody sharp sword appeared in front of the main character, stopping his movement. It was the weapon of that reluctant man who would not go forward. The young man was confident that he would survive. even if he had to finish off the squad leader. The protagonist explained to his comrade that they had no chance of surviving a retreat back where there were plenty of enemies. He loosened the fighter's hand and decided to clarify something for him. Previously, Andrew thought that the commander was a useless piece of trash, but now he thinks differently. Encred seemed to him like his father, who simply gave up and lost the wealth of his house. Before his death, Andrew's father told him that their home was coming to an end. However, he still hoped that his son would become a person who would lead others. His son must gain the trust of the people and become a true leader in order to revive his family name. Now Encred seemed to Andrew to be the man he had always wanted to become. The young man always wanted to become the person who paves the way for everyone. When Andrew went after Encred, the bearded man was against it. Andrew explained to his subordinates that the squad was currently following the orders of their commander, Captain Encred. The protagonist sat down on the ground and told the others to wait for his signal. At the signal from the commander, all members of the squad must begin to move at a goose step. The first step in overcoming today was to seize the initiative. When the young people reached one of the points, they saw arrowheads on top of the tall grass. The second stage in overcoming today should be precisely this point, which the hero discovered after many repetitions of the day. By moving at a goose step, a squad of scouts will be able to avoid combat with nearby knights. Fortunately, everything went according to plan, and the young people managed to reach the designated point without a single loss. The reason why the squad never managed to get out of this field was clear. When the heroes saw something terrible in front of them, they realized that death awaited them. They emerged from the tall grass straight into the enemy camp. Aspen's soldiers kill everyone to silence them, because there is something hidden in this field that no one should know about. The hero was confident in his actions and told his subordinates that they only needed to move forward. The bearded fighter realized that Encred was going to set fire to the enemy camp. He said that they would be surrounded and finished off by knights at that very hour. Commander Encred asked his fellow soldier his name, and he introduced himself as Mac. The protagonist told Mac absolutely calmly that he would not tolerate disobedience. He got angry, but Andrew quickly brought the guy to his senses. The squad won't be able to find their way while the moon is behind the clouds, so they have to trust their commander. The main character approached one of the tents and cut it in half. AK was alarmed by all the actions of the main character. When the scouts entered the tent, they found it empty. Mac didn't understand how Encred knew what would happen next. The young men found themselves in the middle of the camp, but did not meet a single enemy soldier. Encred asked his subordinates to stay where they were and wait for him. The young man had already infiltrated this camp dozens of times. When he first noticed this flag and touched it, the entire army focused its attention on it. The hero explained to everyone that Aspen's soldiers were hiding a flag in this field, and their main task was to protect it. There were about 30 knights guarding that flag. Mac didn't understand how the squad leader knew that there was a flag in this camp. He assumed that the company commander had told Encred everything. The protagonist said that in that case, Aspen's soldiers would be too busy protecting the flag. Mac assumed that Encred was on a secret mission because he had brilliantly infiltrated the enemy camp and taken command. Encred assured his subordinates that they would be able to escape in the confusion caused by the flag catching fire. He suggested that those around him split into two groups. The first group would act as bait and attract the attention of the enemies, and the second would start the fire. Mac announced that he wanted to be on the bait team. The main character was surprised that the young man had been expressing his dissatisfaction all the time, and then suddenly decided to cooperate. Encred had led a squad to the Aspen camp many times before. However, he never had as many people left with him as he does now. The hero had a good feeling, because this was the best of todays that he had ever lived. A squad of scouts carefully crept up to the guards and threw a stone at one of them. When the knight saw Mac hiding, he shouted throughout the camp that they had strangers. The chief knight informed his fellow soldiers that they needed to capture the offenders. The main character ran to the torch and wanted to cope with the task of setting the fire on his own. When he touched the fiery torch, he was determined to end the day safely. But suddenly one of the warriors appeared above him and wanted to cut off his head. However, he struck the handle of the torch and cut it in half. It was an enemy warrior that Encred had never seen in any of these days. It was unclear why the squad leader could not hear the sound of this strong warrior approaching. While Encred and the warrior were looking into each other's eyes, a fire started in one of the tents. The guards were shouted across the street that their camp was on fire. One of the leading knights told his companions to immediately seize the offenders. Mac managed to fight off most of the enemy forces, while Encred took the attention of the rest, so Andrew could set the tents on fire. All of the protagonist's attacks begin with a movement of the legs, that is, a push from the ground that directs the body forward. The main character swung his sword and struck the knight whose defense was weakened. However, he was immediately able to maneuver and avoid death. Encred's most perfect lunge left him wounded in the abdomen. The warrior man turned to the main character and said that he was weak. With his current level of ability, Encredu won't be able to defeat that man. Before that, he had barely managed to reach the camp, having lost several comrades. Encred thought he had finally passed the trials of today through ambushes in the fields and countless deaths, but it turned out that that huge man was a real obstacle to the endless present day. The protagonist knew that he would die like a dog if he challenged the warrior. This means that he will have to take command of the squad again and flee across the fields. The man grabbed his sword and told Encred that he would cut him into pieces to feed the dogs. He swung at Encred, but he managed to step aside from the blow. Despite everything, the hero wanted to overcome this difficult obstacle today. He struck the warrior and their swords met at a single point. The main character brilliantly missed every dangerous blow from the man. Encred noted the opponent's fast and precise movements as a positive, as he blocked his attacks every time. The protagonist didn't have a single chance to counterattack. The difference in abilities between a simple squad leader and a huge warrior was great. Encred launched a sharp blade at his opponent, but he managed to block the blow with his fist. It was too late for the protagonist to retreat, and it was necessary to take some action. While he was thinking about his actions, the man lunged and dealt him a threatening blow with his sword. The fire spreads throughout the camp and goes towards the flag. One of the scouts persistently asked the platoon commander to return everyone to base. The young men realized that Encred was not going to give up without a fight. When the hero grabbed his sword again, the enemy began to retreat. The warrior walked towards the burning flames that surrounded their flask. Encred thought that the real obstacle of the day was not this man. Andrews ran up to the hero, asking for a retreat. However, Encred did not want to listen to the former commander of the scout squad. He kept his eyes on the warrior, who already had one foot in the flames. But suddenly the commander turned back and shouted to his subordinates to retreat. The fire completely covered the knight's flag, and the warriors desperately tried to extinguish it with water. The detachment led by Encred decided to retreat back. One of the guys who was in that detachment disappeared, and now there are only 5 soldiers left. Mac asked if they would send out a large search party to chase them. The main character believed that the knights would not think of this, and therefore they were not in any danger. Crace, who was seriously wounded in the shoulder, appeared near the hero. He moved on his last breath, and suddenly there were knights behind him. Then Encred and Andrew grabbed their swords and decided to engage in battle with the knights. With his first blow, the main character cut off the head of the nearest warrior. At this time, Andrew also beheaded one of the attackers. The squad leader shouted to his subordinates to gather their courage and continue running in the opposite direction. If the heroes continue moving towards the animals' habitats, the knights will not be able to pursue them. One of the soldiers said that he knew a safe route that lay through a hunting trail. The protagonist decided to rely on his colleague and asked him to lead them through this path. The sounds of the pursuers' footsteps were no longer audible. When the heroes reached a safe place, they were followed by several foxes and a black panther. Thanks to the efforts of Mac and Andrew, the scouts were able to easily break away from the knights. If it weren't for Henry and his knowledge of the local trails, the soldiers wouldn't have disappeared so quickly. It took every member of the squad to get this far. When the sun rose above the horizon, the scout detachment returned to camp. Encred's colleagues asked him what had happened to them. The young people looked completely tired and wanted to sleep. Another today has passed and a new day has begun. The enemy camp was destroyed, but part of the flag was not burned. The knights decided to start preparing for battles again. The hero did not expect that the commander of the Grey Dogs Company would not cope with his task along with a bunch of his subordinates. The warriors stationed around the perimeter of the tall grass field were the best of the Grey Dogs, but a small enemy force had broken through the fence and started a fire. The Grey Dogs were an independent company that decided for itself how to act within the framework of an operation. The company's name is borrowed from a dog that lives in the Principality of Aspen. He is distinguished by his particular tenacity and becomes strongly attached to the goal he has set his sights on. One of the knights told the strong man that the one with whom he crossed blades was strong. Grey Dog's platoon commander Mitch Harrier said he would have finished off the enemy if not for the fire. The men thought that the main character was just lucky, which in itself is a good ability. Brave man. Mitch promised that this would never happen again. The fact that Encred had encountered an obstacle and had not overcome it had greatly distressed him. He, like Mitch, wanted to continue the fight and kill his opponent with his own hands. The main character promised himself that he would overcome that man at any cost. At this time, Ram threw the axe to the ceiling and waited for the commander to arrive. He was worried about Encred, and for a second thought that he had died on the battlefield. It would not have been surprising to him that the young commander had taken his own life because of his weak abilities. He admitted that Encred was quite to his liking. Ragnar woke up and also began to wait for the arrival of the squad leader. He saw that Ram was sitting in front of him, looking straight at him. He asked his colleague why he was looking at him, and he showed him the middle finger. Without thinking twice, the young man extended his leg and responded with the same middle finger. After this act, Rem began to threaten Ragnar. Ragnar grabbed his sword and wanted to rush at his opponent. At this time, the company commander asked Encred how he managed to penetrate into enemy territory and start a fire there. The main character replied that he was simply lucky to make the right decision at the right moment. When the fairy sent Encred to rest, he bowed and thanked her for her concern. The girl assumed that Encred would throw something like this onto the battlefield, but the result exceeded her expectations. She was curious about who the squad leader really was. The main character was interested in what was on the company commander's mind. Andrew approached Encred and apologized for his initial rudeness. He was grateful to the hero for allowing him to survive. He asked for another meeting and Encred promised to meet on the battlefield. When the main character began to leave for his tent, all the scouts bowed to him in unison. On the battlefield, Encrid had saved 4 people, and he was sure that this was not his maximum. He lost 2 soldiers on the battlefield, and if he had been a little stronger, he could have saved them. The streak of identical days allowed Encrid to look beyond. Now he must follow the path of the knight he dreams of becoming and move only forward, overcoming today's walls. Suddenly, someone shouted from the side that Rem and Ragna were fighting again. The men attacked each other, and each of them did not want to retreat. There was real horror and killing intent in their eyes. The protagonist saw this expression on their faces for the first time. He had sparred many times with the squad members, but had never seen them like this during a fight with him. Encrid decided for himself that first of all he would make his comrades make such faces in front of him. Suddenly, the soldiers looked around and saw that the detachment commander had arrived. Rem reproached Encrid for not reporting his return and spying on them like a wild cat. Rem also offered the commander to engage in sparring with him, and Ragna only inquired about his state of health. The main character asked his fellow soldier how he managed to repel the enemy's formidable attack. After that, he turned to Ragna and asked about his brilliant attack. The young man noticed that something was wrong with his commander. The main character did not understand what exactly his subordinate meant. When he asked Ragna about this, he asked him to forget everything he had just said. Encrid realized that Ragna was not telling him something. Upon learning of the enemy ambush, the battalion commander deployed all infantry closer to the field covered with tall grass. During the journey, the hero's wounds healed greatly, and in his free time he studied strategy and trained. When Encrid went to training, Kreis asked him to rest for a while. All of the commander's subordinates did not like the fact that he was running to training without having fully recovered. After some time, a new day dawned in the military camp. Ragna looked around the tent and realized that the commander had gone off to train again. The young man grabbed his sword and went to the main character, as he had a talent for fencing. Ragna believed that becoming strong was easy. He believed that it was not worth straining and wasting energy to become a knight. Previously, he wanted to become a knight, but now he sees no point and therefore has lost his goal and is marking time. When he approached Encrin, he was training with all his might with the sword. After a while, he became quite tired and took a short break. Ragna noticed that the commander had been learning incorrectly from the very beginning. He believed that first of all it was necessary to master the basics of fencing. Having mastered all sorts of simplified methods, you can forget about improving, no matter how much you train. Yet Ragna didn't understand why Encrid was trying so hard, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. He approached the main character and asked why he needed all this. He replied that he just wanted to become stronger. He then asked what Encrid was going to do in the future, and he replied that he would definitely become a knight. The young man saw no point in becoming a knight who was only good in combat. However, the main character had his own beliefs, because he tries for the sake of the weak and disadvantaged, as well as pride and loved ones. He dreamed of becoming an outstanding knight who deserves respect among society. Ragna understood that physical strength was only a tool. He thought for a few moments and could not understand what exactly he had always dreamed about. Unexpectedly, Ragna offered to teach Encrid how to use a sword. Encrid immediately agreed to his colleague's proposal. Ragna realized that he had stuttered in vain and had created unnecessary stress for himself. But still, the main character's gaze promises that it won't be boring. Ragna noted that the whole problem was that Rem taught the commander the beast heart technique. He asked Encrid to forget everything he knew before. He also noted that the sword technique of the mercenary Valen should be especially forgotten. If Encrid doesn't forget this, then when using a new technique he will, out of habit, use what is more convenient. Ragna then suggested that the commander renounce everything and gain completely new knowledge, or be content with what he had. Encrid confidently chose the first option, that is, to gain completely new skills. He decided to bring the conversation down to business, and asked Ragna where they would start. The young man offered Encrid his 1.5-handed sword, because a strong man needs to use more than a light weapon. Encrid received advice on sword grip from his subordinate, but despite this advice, he still grabbed the sword with special force, and Ragna did not like it. The young man immediately realized that the commander had already learned a similar grip somewhere. Next, the main character learned to get into the basic stance. Ragna struck Encrid sharply, and he did not expect such sharpness. The blow made his sword tremble, and the protagonist became somewhat alarmed. Encrid told his subordinate that he shouldn't do that because it hurt him. Ragna explained that Encrid would break all his bones if he stood in one position while attacking, relying only on strength. The protagonist understood that Ragna meant that Encrid was straining his entire body to put strength into his hands. He needs to become more flexible if he doesn't want to break anything. Also, his attacks need to be given some maneuverability. During further training, Ragna taught the commander to monitor the center of gravity. He made some comments about the way Encrid's legs were positioned. When the swords touched, the hero unconsciously tensed his hands, and Ragna reprimanded him. The young man laughed at the commander because his movements resembled some kind of dance. After another attack, the main character could not stand still and fell. Previously, Ragna had never thought that Encrid was so incapable, and that he didn't even have swordsmanship skills. He believed that training in this situation would hardly help one become strong. However, Encrid demanded that his subordinate train again and again. The young man regretted offering his commander help in training. He decided to start his next training session by learning to walk. As the young men began to train, Rem approached them. Rem reproached Ragna and Encrid for playing at being friends. Rem noticed that Ragna was bullying Encrid and decided to deal with him. The hero did not interfere in the conflict and asked Rem where he was going. The courageous Rem replied that he was ready to leave for the call-up. At this time, the military camp received news that the enemy was approaching. The company commander gathered all her subordinates into one army and set a combat mission. A team of fighters also set out to carry out the assigned task, and Encrid was at their head. Ragna immediately regretted teaching the captain fencing, because now he could get confused and not be able to fight at full strength. The young man did not want to take responsibility for what he had done wrong in the captain's actions. He decided that in today's battle he would not stray far from Encrid. The main character did not understand what was happening, because he still wanted to learn how to wield a sword. There was no announcement of war for those present, and it seemed to everyone that this was just another formation. However, at this time, the night wizard tried to inflict damage on everyone. He stood in the field near the main flag and sent fog with his spells. For a few moments, the company commander caught herself thinking that witchcraft was happening. The fog spread across the entire perimeter and did not allow armed soldiers to go deeper. The main character thought that it was just a natural fog that was creating difficulties for them. He couldn't even see those who were standing right in front of him and behind him. Encrid realized that today's battle would not be easy. All the soldiers heard a strange sound coming from the depths of the field. The main character shouted to everyone that arrows were flying at them. Indeed, about 1,000 arrows flew at the soldiers and cut them into pieces. Fortunately, the company commander was not injured, as she maneuvered brilliantly from each of the arrows. She commanded her surviving subordinates to duck and raise their shields. It was an unnatural fog. The enemy simply chose a special tactic. The enemy knight was glad that he managed to complete this spell despite spending most of his strength. Once the spell is fully activated, a thick fog will block everyone's vision. While remaining under the flag transmitter of witchcraft, one can see and attack the enemy unilaterally. The knight couldn't stop bragging about how he managed to complete the spell, considering that almost all the flags were burned. He told his subordinate that it would be easier if that young man were not on the field. Mitch immediately realized that they were talking about Encrid. 1,000 arrows continued to fly towards the allies. One of the arrows passed very close to Encrid, but he managed to dodge it. From the voice behind him, the hero discovered that it was Ragna. In front of him was Rem, who immediately realized that everything that was happening around him was witchcraft. The subordinates were right under the commander's nose, but it was impossible to see them. This is why the main character will not be able to fight at full strength. His breathing was heavy, his body too tense. The wooden legs hardly moved from their place and brought with them yet another death. He remembered Ragna's words, who said that despite the training, he would not give up his old habits immediately. Then Ragna suggested not to engage in battles at all until Encrid had mastered the new knowledge perfectly. The main character grabbed the sword and decided to go forward. Ragna asked the squad leader not to make any rash moves. The main character thought he had found a way, but he only attempted to implement it once. When he came much closer to the enemy, he immediately saw the tip of a spear in the fog. The enemy, without thinking, pierced Encrid's chest right through. There was emptiness in the protagonist's eyes, and at that moment he decided that he would definitely return to training with Ragna. The knight asked Encrid to die as soon as possible and not to resist fate. The knight dealt a few more blows and killed the main character. Another new day of this difficult today has arrived. This time Encrid thought that Ragna was a bad teacher. Ragna believed that Encrid did not understand anything with his body, but thought only with his head. The hero asked his subordinate where he should shift his center of gravity. The young man became confused in his thoughts, and the hero realized that he did not know how to teach other people. Although Ragna's explanations are meager, listening and remembering is one of Encrid's specialties. Half a day passed, and the heroes saw flying arrows again. This time the commander skillfully handled the sword and deflected the arrows. However, his body was still made of wood and stone. As he advanced forward across the battlefield, he came across a spear again. He didn't mind dying and learning swordsmanship again. The next day, Rana again taught the commander fencing and dealt him various blows. This was already the 30th time today, but Encrid's movements had gained some flexibility. Ragna praised the hero for his good fencing techniques. The young man explained that one should use the sword as a defense and turn it in different directions. He dealt the commander a direct blow and asked him to keep a distance between the enemy and him in the future. If a warrior can block the enemy's line of attack and increase his own, then he will be an excellent warrior. The protagonist soon went to the battlefield, where he again met the armed knight. When he struck him with a spear, Encrid skillfully dodged it. Thanks to his light feet, he can easily dodge attacks. When he had gone some distance, he ran into many arrows. 3 arrows pierced the main character's body and he died on the spot. Fortunately, today was changing little by little and bringing some successes. Although slowly, the main character now showed movements that could no longer be faulted. Ragna didn't understand where his commander got his fencing skills from. As the battle with the knights approached, Encrid once again went forward to attack the enemy. Death did not bring him regret, but only made it clear that thanks to it the hero would be able to develop better physically. After each such death, he practiced his blows with Ragna with special enthusiasm. He used the sword skillfully, as if it had been with him since birth. After another death, the 100th day of today has arrived. Ragna thought for a moment and asked the important Encrid who he was. This time, the protagonist's gaze changed and acquired maximum self-confidence. It seemed to him that his abilities had reached their limit. As he charged forward towards the enemy, Ragna tried to stop him. He did not listen to his subordinate and followed his own goals. He stopped for a moment and let the dangerous spear pass in front of him. Thanks to Ragna's advice, he was able to focus his attention on the end of the arrow. Encrid personally promised himself to reach this place at any cost. Even when he was absolutely confident in his actions, he still continued to run into the spears of his enemies. He felt joy from the fact that he existed beyond this unbearable pain. When the new day arrived, Ragna was incomprehensible to the fact that his commander wanted to learn fencing. He said that through fencing he could become much stronger. After some movements, Ragna noted that Encrid had not been so skilled before. He assumed that the main character had been fighting poorly on purpose all this time. From his subordinate, Encrid learned that his basic knowledge was enough to win the battle. However, when arrows were flying towards the main character, he again felt some self-doubt. More than 200 of today's days have already passed. Now Encrid did not stand still, maneuvering left and right and making various lunges to avoid colliding with the spear. He wanted to test how far he could go with the power he had mastered and the knowledge he had gained. When he met the knight, he skillfully avoided his sharp spear. After a well-aimed maneuver, he dealt the knight a fatal blow. The enemy's head flew off to the side, giving Encrid some confidence. The main character remembered where the enemy was behind the fog and at what moment he could jump out. The fog also worked against the knights, because they could not see anything in it. Only from all this did they understand that there was something terrible ahead of them that was destroying their comrades. One of the knights tried to fight back with a crossbow and managed to kill Encrid. During training, Ragna reminded Encrid about eye, leg, and arm movements. After further advice from his subordinate, the main character was able to kill the knight who had killed him the previous day. He was happy that his hands remembered all the training and completed what they started. His feelings were completely different than before he mastered the basics. Like a wild beast, he asked his enemies to attack him again and again. This time he was ready to kill everyone until several crossbowmen came out to meet him. They didn't kill him right away, but only entered into a dialogue with him. One of the knights noted Encrid's combat training as being better, but at the end of the conversation hinted that he would not be able to leave here alive. The main character realized that he would not be able to fight such a crowd alone. When crossbows were pointed at him, he challenged his opponent to fight with swords like men. On this present day before his death, he wanted to test himself once again. One of the knights thought that he was facing a madman and ordered his comrades to shoot. The knights immediately shot at the main character, and he fell dead to the ground. The faceless creature believed that Encrid was a fool who threw himself into the arms of death. Death didn't scold him this time, just told him that he was out of his mind. In the morning, the main character woke up in his bed again. It had never happened before that Death simply scolded and left. He wondered who was in the clouds. In front of him, Encrid saw Rem, who had been shouting about witchcraft throughout the field the previous day. Every time the heroes were covered in fog, he shouted that it was witchcraft. The same thing happened in the field when the knights defended their flag. The hero decided to ask Rem what he knew about witchcraft. He didn't understand what the question was about, but Encrid explained that he was tormented by curiosity. First, Rem asked the commander if he knew the difference between magic and witchcraft. The men found that magic was more widespread than witchcraft. Rem said that for witchcraft you need a guide and you can't do without one. Encrid immediately realized that the enemy had spread the fog using witchcraft, and that the flag was acting as a guide. He thought that if he broke the flag, the fog would clear. According to the subordinate, true sorcerers can be counted on the fingers of one hand, and those who wander around the continent are mostly charlatans. The main character abruptly ended the conversation and left the tent. He told Ram that he was going to another training session. During training, Ragna thanked the army for teaching him and Encrid the same basics. According to Ragna, there are 5 sword styles. 500 years ago, an extraordinary genius was born who, at the age of 9, killed 12 robbers with 1 poker. Having lost his parents early, he mastered the principles of fencing, after which one nobleman learned about him and accepted him into his family. So this genius received a new name, Lion Izanyak. However, heaven sent the boy not only talent, but also adversity, because from the age of 10 his limbs began to lose strength. Ragna added that that boy in the future divided the continental art of fencing into before and after. From his subordinate, the protagonist learned that thanks to this division, there are 5 types of fencing. Leones rewrote the history of fencing, and with his help the family line became the strongest in the empire. Ragna said that the heavy sword is common in the north, the slashing and flowing swords are common in the central region, and the rest are common in the west and south. To master the heavy sword technique, Encrid will need the heart of a beast. Ragna believed that there was something more useful than this skill, namely concentration on one point. This technique requires you to forget about everything around you, focusing only on the enemy and the sword. Ragna dealt the protagonist a blow that he did not expect to see. A slight movement of the sword managed to cut Encrid's neck, and blood flowed out. The blow was faster than Rem's axe, and Encrid feared that he was about to die. Ragna asked the squad leader what he felt at that moment. At this time, Rem burst into the training session. He was angry because his enemy Ragna tried to kill the commander. Ragna explained that mortal danger increased concentration, and his threat only helped with his training. The men began to argue about the teaching methods, but the protagonist believed that they both explained poorly. Encrid decided to put an end to this squabble and called Rem with him. Before leaving, Ragna advised the hero to try to feel how his nerves heat up at the moment of mortal danger. If Encrid successfully masters the concentration on the point, he will feel the sword begin to move in the desired direction. The main character wanted to fight in a real battle as soon as possible in order to grasp the whole essence of training. Another target appeared before him, a flag that was a conduit for the fog summoning spell. Only by getting rid of the spell will he be able to repel the enemy's one-sided attacks. First of all, he wanted to break the flag, and only then deal with the knights. He rushed forward to attack and cut down several opponents along the way. If Rem or Ragna had been with him, they would have easily reached the flag. Encrid continued to kill everyone in his path who tried to strike him. This time he decided to go as far as his strength would allow. However, he could not concentrate on one point, and he died time after time, without even knowing its essence. Hearing training is necessary to avoid dying at the hands of an assassin. The heart of the beast is required to cut and maneuver on the battlefield, but concentration on one point is needed for another. During his training, Encrid learned to concentrate on the tip of the sword. Ragna explained that if the technique worked, the person could feel the sword slowing down. The main character did not understand anything, and thought that the beast's heart was hindering him in training. According to the subordinate, the surroundings should blur, and the eyes should see only the enemy and the sword. Encrid asked Ragna how he learned to concentrate. The young man explained that he managed to do this without any training. One day he focused on one point, and this technique worked for him. Encrid decided to continue his concentration training and wanted to break the flag first. He planned to minimize the losses of his comrades and penetrate the enemy camp. When the space filled with fog again, the hero commanded his fellow soldiers to take out their shields and crouch. The main character himself took out his shield and sword and crouched in a safe position. 1,000 arrows flew in his direction and in the direction of his comrades. The soldiers' skillful actions were able to repel most of the arrow attacks. Today was the 300th day in a row. Encrid knew with his eyes closed at what moment the attack would be launched against him. He maneuvered perfectly behind the knights and dealt them a sudden blow. His sword was able to cut off the heads of hundreds of knights. The enemy soldiers did not understand where such a crazy fighter came from. The knights were ordered to seize this madman immediately. The protagonist swung his sword from side to side and cut the knights into pieces. He was absolutely confident in every action he took. The knight guarding the flag ordered his subordinates to stop this bloodshed. In appearance, the main character resembled a man who had escaped from a mental hospital. He was only a couple of steps away from his cherished goal. This is the 10th day today that he has been making his way to this flag, and it all ends. This time he was able to cut the flag in half, but the spell did not disappear. Nothing had changed around, and the fog still covered the entire battlefield. Suddenly, the main character received several spear blows in the back. The knight assumed that the hero was familiar with their witchcraft. He explained to the dying man that this flag was a trap for him. Encrid realized that among the 5 flags, one was real and the rest were fake. In the next battles, he will have to find the real one among the fake ones. As he rushed forward towards the enemy, his comrades decided to stand still. Despite the low probability that he would now arrive at the right flag, he still believed in himself. When he saw the danger, he shouted to those standing behind him to duck and take up their shields. However, the soldiers of his army did not hear the signal given. The main character raised his shield above himself and protected himself from the flying arrows. The soldiers who did not hear the signal were hit by several arrows. The young man did not understand why the soldiers did not obey his order, like last time. Encrid spent 3 of today's days to reach the second flag. This time, before he died, he was able to discover that he had come to a false flag. He reached the 3rd flag he spotted after spending 5 of today's days, but that too turned out to be bait. It took 7 days to reach the 4th, but the same thing awaited the hero. Fortunately, he no longer felt the moment when several spears were flying at him. There were only 2 flags left, and one of them was real. The main character caught himself thinking that today he would be able to reach the desired flag. He decided to choose the one in the middle, and he didn't yet know that it was the right decision. As the field was covered in fog, Encrid ordered his soldiers to duck and raise their shields. Thanks to his loud voice, the warriors carried out the command and protected themselves from the arrows. This time, Encrid found Rem next to him and called him to attack. The man did not want to commit certain suicide, but he still obeyed the commander. The main character set himself the goal of not getting tired until he reaches the real flag. It was decided that Rem would draw the enemy's attention to himself while Encrid made his way to the flag. Rem killed knights, and in the process wondered whose handiwork this magic was. When he was not given a clear answer, he would pounce on the next victim. The number of todays in which Encrid died has exceeded 1 year, and then through the fog he saw the enemy flag fluttering. He was sure that with one blow he would now cut through all the magic. Suddenly, one of the opponent's strongest fighters appeared in front of him. He told Encred that God had heard his prayers. Mitch wanted Encred to die at his hands. The main character only asked the man who he was. Mitch said they saw Encred a couple of days ago. The hero, who had already lived 100 of today's days, could not remember this young man. The man insistently urged Encred to remember his name. When he couldn't remember Mitch decided to remind him with a sword strike. The protagonist was able to concentrate his attention on the tip of the sword. When he dodged the blow, Mitch didn't understand how he managed to do it. The next moment, Encred lunged forward with his foot and struck back at Mitch. The man didn't understand where that weakling got such abilities from, because last time he wasn't like that. He became alarmed because the protagonist's skill had grown immeasurably. Encred made another lunge, but the enemy's sword appeared in front of his face. In the next moment, the swords of the strongest men intertwined into one. Thanks to the technique, the hero realized that in front of him was a follower of the slashing sword. Mitch's attacks also incorporate a fluid, flowing sword style. To Mitch and Encred's surprise, no one from outside interfered. As Encred concentrated all his attention on the sword, his balance noticeably shifted. The main character had a new goal and forgot about the enemy camp flag. Also, the outcome of the battle and the basics of fencing went out of his head. He was able to adhere to the rules of concentration, but still died by the sword. His hot blood flowed in a stream onto the enemy's sword. As he sank to the ground, the sword never took its eyes off him. At this moment, the main character said that he remembered the man's name. It was Mitch who blocked Encred's path to the flag on the field back then. The man introduced himself as the platoon commander of the Grey Dogs Company of the Duchy of Aspen, and Encred as the commander of the detachment of the Kingdom of Norilia. Knights approached Mitch and asked about the enemy's infiltration. Mitch's subordinates noticed that he looked annoyed. At the moment of death, Encred realized that what he really needed was not concentration. Thanks to Mitch, he realized that he needed a worthy opponent who would inspire him. In this fight, the hero put everything on the line to fight and risk his own life. The next morning, Ragna again explained concentration on one point. However, the main character listened to his subordinate with half an ear, and he immediately noticed it. Rem approached the young people and called them to gather. Ragna couldn't decide whether the commander was filled with determination, or whether he had decided to surrender. Thanks to Encred, Ragna decided to give himself a tough training session today. More than 100 times fog covered the battlefield. According to the studied scenario, the commander ordered the soldiers to bend down and take out their shields. Encred again called Rem, who was shouting about witchcraft. This time Ragna decided to go for a breakthrough together with his comrades. Rem told Ragnu that he shouldn't go there because he was too weak for it. While fighting, the soldiers did not notice how enemy knights were approaching them. Rem mercilessly killed everyone he met on the go. Ragna armed himself with a sword and also cut off the heads from the knights' shoulders. The protagonist wanted to break through the same way as before and meet Mitch again. When they met, Encred challenged Mitch to fight him. He explained to his alarmed opponent that he fell in love with him at first sight. In the fight, Mitch said that this is the first time someone has found him before he does. Without showing his upset state, the man began to take active actions. Focusing on the sword, the protagonist received a fatal blow. He felt hurt that he had lost so easily at that moment in this battle. It was only after 100 deaths that Encred realized that he did not have to go to his death intentionally. He believed that he had to succumb to the charm of the sword. Experiencing the moment over and over again, he will still find the right path. Encred saw an armed Mitch in front of him for the 18th time. The protagonist's death before Mitch reached the 28 mark, and then the 58 mark. At the training, Ragna wanted to show the main idea of fencing. He threw a sharp sword at Encred, but he didn't move an inch. Encred continued to look at the tip of the sword to practice the technique he had learned. After this, the men entered into real sparring and dealt powerful blows to each other. Ragna didn't understand how his commander could master such techniques. He noted Encred's concentration skill as an improvement. With complete concentration, the body became one with the sword. Strength and skill increased beyond recognition before today repeated itself. The protagonist grabbed his sword and went to meet the company commander. He believed that the time had come to step beyond the repetitive present day. When he came to the company commander, he reported to her about the witchcraft that he allegedly saw during reconnaissance. He said that Aspen's soldiers called the suspicious man Mr. Sorcerer. Fortunately, the girl listened to her subordinate's words. In order to win this battle, Encred passed on all the information he knew. He was sure that this time his subordinates would raise their shields for the last time at his command. On the part of his comrades, all that remains is to hope for the brilliant talent of the military leader. And the main character's duty was to cut the flag and kill Mitch. Every time he met Mitch, he was frightened by his appearance. It was today that the main character decided not to get to know the man, but to call him by name. He explained his behavior by saying that he wanted to fight Mitch from their first meeting. He promised the man that today he would defeat him once and for all. Encred struck with his sword, but his opponent managed to maneuver to the side. The main character skillfully applied all the techniques that Ragna taught him. This time there was confusion in Mitch's eyes. Previously, he could easily parry his opponent's blows, but now he has to use force. During the battle, he asked Encred why he hid his talent in fencing. After a short dialogue, the men introduced themselves to each other as the commanders of their units. Mitch promised that he would remember the main character's name. Encrid laughed and said that if he forgot, he would definitely remind him more than once. Encrid's full attention was focused on the blade of the sword. After a few dozen repetitions of today, the hero was able to learn that now there will be a slanting cut from Mitch. Having collected the technique and experience gained from repetition, Encrid sees a clear picture before him. He swung his sword at Mitch and cut his neck. However, the sword did the same thing at that very moment and damaged the main character's neck. Seeing a sharp sword in front of him, the man realized that his life was over. However, he was able to get out of the situation and make the right maneuver. Previously, he thought that he could easily kill Encrid in a couple of attacks. He didn't understand why he was on the same level as some pathetic warrior. His slashing and flowing sword was not enough to make a deadly attack. However, for this case, he has a secret technique. He planned to draw a large circle with his sword from the bottom up and strike with a backhand. This technique was called circular cutting. The protagonist was able to notice the technique that hit him several times. In the previous days, he could not predict its trajectory and the beginning of the attack. As Mitch delivered his perfect strike, Encrid knocked it aside. The Harrier family line is one of the 3 key families that dominate Aspan. The Harrier clan gathered under its wing all those who showed talent for martial arts. Mitch has proven his skills with extraordinary talent. By the age of 15, he could easily defeat 2 adult soldiers. By the age of 18, he had defeated enough swordsmen in duels to fill an entire village. By the age of 22, his name had become famous throughout the entire city. Based on his abilities alone, he became one of the 3 strongest members of the Grey Dogs. His worthy opponents could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Mitch didn't think he needed to train until his legs were swollen and swing a sword until his palms were raw. He was always proud of his talent and was too arrogant. It was today that his self-confidence brought him ruin and a mortal wound. The protagonist, with a strange feeling in his chest, thrust his sharp sword into Mitch. Mitch was disappointed that he couldn't beat a weak opponent. His eyes were filled with regret and fear. Finally, after 100 days, the main character considered himself the winner. Mitch admitted that Encrid was inferior to him in strength and skill. However, this was not the main indicator because death was waiting for him at the door. The protagonist swung to deliver the fatal blow, but something stopped him. Mitch regretted that he had been careless and had not put in more effort all this time. Someone from the outside shouted to the knights to protect Mitch from the attack. A huge warrior appeared between Encrid and Mitch, standing up to protect his comrade. The other knights went to Mitch and gave him first aid. The commander ordered his subordinates to move Mitch to a safe place. The knights obeyed his order and carried the wounded man to his quarters. The commander didn't expect Encrid to break through and make so much noise. He took a swing at the main character and promised that he would not leave here alive. Encrid must not forget that he is in enemy territory. When he looked back, he saw that he was surrounded by about 10 knights. Even if he dies, he will try to tear down the witch flag and pave the way for retreat. It was today that defined Encrida, that very wall. The enemy commander ordered his subordinates to shoot at Encrid. When the arrows flew at the main character, he mentally said goodbye to life. He managed to repel the enemy attacks and rush at the commander. He knew he couldn't dodge all the attacks, but he tried his best to push forward. The man swung at the main character and promised that he would now bring him death. However, the men's swords were intertwined into one. With just one strike, Encrid's sword cracked and trembled with force. The enemy is a master of the heavy sword style. The main character decided to achieve today's goal and destroy the flag by any means necessary. As he threw the knife at the flag over and over again, the enemy commander insulted him in every possible way. Encrid aimed at the connecting part of the flag and the flagpole, but missed every time. It looks like the main character will have to die a few more times to break through to the front. He threw the knife at the flag again, but it flew upward. Even though Encrid reported the witchcraft and requested backup, the authorities did nothing. A potato, not a man, was sent to the front lines as a battalion commander. At this rate, the complete destruction of the army is only a matter of time. Suddenly, the company commander discovered that the magic had begun to disappear. Among hundreds of corpses, the knights were able to find each other. While they were unable to comprehend what was happening, the company commander impaled them on her bayonet. The fog cleared and threw the enemy into confusion, and this was the chance for the army of New Aurelia to turn the tide. The army of comrades gathered together and went on the attack. The absence of fog improved the situation, but it was unclear who had actually broken the spell. The company commander assumed that this was Encrid's doing. At this time, the main character was exhausted, because there were several arrows in his limbs. He was mistaken in his thoughts that if he went back to his camp, he would definitely meet his fellow soldiers. Rem, who was surrounded by knights, asked them to return the spell. According to him, the absence of fog will cause combat losses to the enemy side. When Ragna discovered the absence of the fog, he was ready to engage in combat with the nearest people, but they were his own countrymen. But in front of the main character, there were enemy knights who wanted to kill him. When one of the knights swung at Encrid, he warned him to surrender. Before Encrid could think, he saw a black panther in front of him. A wild cat attacked one of the enemy's armed soldiers. None of those present understood where this beast came from. The knights struck the animal several times with arrows, but it continued to attack them. The wild cat attacked 3 enemy soldiers at once. One of the knights said that the panther broke the bowstring of the crossbow. The panther approached the main character and stood up for him. Ancred asked the cat to run away from the battlefield in order to stay alive. He wanted to stop the cat by force, but suddenly someone stopped him. An armed Virkans intervened in the situation. He wanted to deal with the commander of the Grey Dogs himself, but at the first attack he fell to the ground and regretted that he had come to this place. Rising to his feet, he ordered the soldiers to shoot the man. The Grey Dogs' commander skillfully repelled all attacks with a single weapon. Suddenly, a black panther appeared above his head and wanted to bite him. Realizing what was happening, the man shot an arrow into the animal's side. The panther fell to the ground, and the man ran to attack the main character. In this fight, Ancred continued his sword concentration technique. However, a man's actions cannot be blocked by force, and in this case, you will have to use other tactics. The weapons of the enemies were intertwined into one whole. The protagonist decided to use the technique that Mitch Harrier had previously used. He slid out of the way of the blow perfectly and found himself safe. The Grey Dogs commander didn't understand where Mitch's sliding technique came from on the battlefield. The protagonist was glad that this technique worked and brought some results. Vergence struck the huge man, but he remained standing. Everyone present understood that they would not be able to defeat a strong opponent. The man turned to the main character and said that he would never forget him. After this, he shouted to his knights to retreat back. Vergence rushed to help Ancred, who took care of the panther's condition. He took her in his arms and Vergence carried them both to his camp. The commander shouted to his subordinates to all retreat back. Along the way, the main character slowly closed his eyes and lost consciousness. After a few moments, he closed his eyes and stopped hearing the world around him. Death reproached the protagonist for not being able to fulfill his desires. She didn't understand what was making Ancred do this. Oddly enough, in the morning the main character woke up in the infirmary of his unit. When the main character finally came to his senses, he felt something soft and warm next to him. It was a panther, which, like the main character, was saved. In front of Ancred were all the members of his squad, who were worried about his health. The young man did not understand what had actually happened and whether he had died. Jackson said the commander had lost a lot of blood and lost consciousness. Crace approached the commander and said that luck was clearly on his side. Ancred realized he had passed out on the way back to camp. Once everyone present realized that Ancred was okay, they gradually left the infirmary. It was surprising, but the day was successfully survived. Of all the subordinates, only Rem and Crace remained in the chamber. When the man looked at the commander, Ancred thought he wanted to pet the panther. However, the man asked the commander how he managed to recognize witchcraft. The main character understood that no one would believe that this would happen again today, and he decided to lie. However, because of Rem's nobility, he said that one of the settlers, like Rem, told him about witchcraft. Thanks to this story, the main character assumed that this could be it. From the intonation, Rem understood that the commander had just lied to him, and in conclusion asked him not to get carried away with witchcraft. Ram said that on the battlefield he went to look at the face of the one who planted the flag. Since he didn't like him, the man decided to kill him. Ancred realized that it was Rem who had figured out the spell, not him. At this time, Crace crept up on the main character and the panther. When the young man wanted to pet the panther, she roared angrily at him. The hero warned Kraz that his heart could be torn to pieces, but Kraz said that it would break if he refused 10,000 crowns. Crace said that in front of them was a black panther, nicknamed the Lake Panther because of its blue eyes. One claw of this animal is worth 10,000 crowns, considering that the panther sheds them from time to time. The protagonist was told that after turning it off without the fog, the advantage was on their side, but they had to return to the camp without victory. After that, several days passed without military action, but he still remembers that slide. Jackson asked his commander not to train until his wounds were completely healed. Ragna was also worried about his commander and advised him to go to bed. Rem asked his comrade not to instill his laziness in the commander. Ragna avoided the conflict and went to get his sword. Ancred informed his subordinate that he easily used a technique that he had never trained in his life. Rem believed that the beast's heart allows one to discern a certain technique in an opponent and then repeat it. Ragna said that this was due to concentration on one point. With all this, the main character was just lucky, since with his skills, he would have had to repeat something a couple of 100 times. Due to repeated events, the main character became stronger through his own efforts. Despite his meager talents, he was able to win. He informed his subordinates Ragnu and Rem that he wanted to duel them. The men politely refused to fight, since their commander was noticeably stronger than them. The company commander entered the room and asked Ancred not to engage in training. In fact, she came to ask if he had broken the witchcraft conductor. The protagonist knew that sooner or later the management would have questions, and he agreed with the statement. He reported that he had seen witchcraft during his reconnaissance, and also had some knowledge that he had received earlier. The girl did not understand how the squad leader was able to find the necessary flag among 5 decoys. The company commander said that she came here to take a closer look at Ancred. because for several days now she has been thinking about the fact that she is connected to him by fate. None of those present understood how to correctly interpret the company commander's words. Suddenly, one of the subordinates entered the room and said that an esquire from the knightly order had arrived. The Enkrita division was named after Cyprus, which belongs to the Knights of the Red Cloaks. An esquire is a subordinate, an apprentice rolled into one, following a knight. By gaining the recognition of a knight, the squire becomes a junior knight, and at the last step of the summit, there is a knight who has surpassed the human limit. Usually, squires do not participate in a massacre without knights, so the guest on the battlefield is going to become a junior knight. The military camp announced that it was time to prepare for battle when the squire appeared. The protagonist was told to rest, but he wanted to see it with his own eyes. Ideals that are achievable only in dreams are right now before the eyes of the protagonist. In addition to the 1,000-strong army, Enkrid's entire detachment was present on the battlefield. As the two opposing armies stood waiting for battle, Esquire stepped into the center. Several archers immediately began to take aim at him. One of the commanders shouted to his subordinates to shoot the young man immediately. Many arrows flew at Esquire, but he skillfully turned away from them. His cloak shattered the arrows into many small pieces. After this, the young man gathered his strength and rushed towards the armed knights. The young man entered into battle with 1,000 armed men with absolute confidence. With one blow, he repelled several attackers and cut them into pieces. All subsequent attacks brought the enemy multiple casualties. The protagonist's mouth dropped open from the squire's perfect blows. The enemy knights did not understand what kind of deadly creature was in front of them. As the squire continued the battle, the enemy began to think about retreating. One of the knights asked his comrades to save him from this madman. However, they didn't have time to do anything, since their comrade's head had already flown off his shoulders. Surprisingly, the young man beheaded the knight by mounting his horse. Thanks to Auden's prayers, Enkrid's army did not have to engage in battle. The protagonist noticed that the squire had a combination of a heavy sword and a dancing sword, as well as elements of a striking sword. The slashing sword pulls the enemy into attack range and delivers a decisive blow. The heavy sword cuts through everything in its path with its powerful slashing attacks. The illusory sword attacks suddenly, fooling the enemy. The dancing sword attacks with lightning speed. The flowing sword evades the enemy's attack, striking back. Esquire Enkrid felt both a dancing sword and a heavy sword, which were completely different from each other. Although the principle of each fencing style is different from each other, they all have the same origins. If you know all the elements of the 5 sword styles, you can perceive the sword as a living being. The Enkrid army gathered together and rushed to break through to the enemy. Enkrid's subordinates had no intention of attacking, since those soldiers could handle it without them. The hero concluded that the captain decided to throw the shell first. The young men decided not to interfere with the young soldiers attacking the enemy. Having achieved knowledge, the protagonist could not say that anything had changed. Knowledge merely indicates how far the path is which he must travel. Absolutely everyone from Enkrid's army rushed at the enemy, except for himself and his team. However, the young man wanted to check what was on top of the wall he needed to climb. The army of soldiers planned to kill every single enemy knight. They also planned to redraw the state borders tonight. The war is drawing to a close, and the coming winter and spring promised to be busy. There was real chaos in the kingdom of Aspen. The Duke was worried that the enemy had violated the unspoken rules of not involving the forces of the knightly order in the battle. A subordinate reported to the Duke that the enemies used General Frog's appearance as a pretext to take advantage of the knightly order's power. If Frog had not intervened in the battle, the enemies would have found another excuse besides him. If the magic had worked successfully, this battle would not have happened. The Duke believed that the Grey Dogs should be held accountable for what happened. Mitch's commander said they would not let this happen go unpunished. After a protracted battle in Aspen's retreat, the detachment moved back. The town on the border with Aspen consisted almost entirely of the stationed army. At a public meeting, the servicemen announced that they highly appreciated the contribution of the heroes who achieved victory in this battle. The commander of the 4th Squad, Enkrid, was awarded for destroying the enemy's magic. No one present thought that this was his merit. Everyone believed that Enkrid had appropriated the merits of his subordinates. Enkrid's subordinates asked those around them to shut their mouths and thank Enkrid for saving them. The main character went to the podium, where he was presented with a cash reward. When he was offered to donate these funds to something valuable, he asked to be taken to an artificial blacksmith. It was wild for Crace that the commander decided to spend all the money on buying a sword. He was sure that he had picked up enough swords to last the entire squad for the rest of their lives. To become a knight, Enkrid needs to acquire a strong weapon. After purchasing the sword, he announced that he was going to take the exam to advance in rank. The protagonist saw no point in remaining a low-level soldier his entire life. Crace offered to help pave the way. The Enkrid division uses a ranking system to boost the morale of its soldiers. Strong soldiers who go beyond the ranks are assigned to a special rank, and the attitude towards the soldier changes according to his rank. To climb the ladder, you need to fight in a duel and defeat 3 soldiers of the corresponding rank. Therefore, for the assembled soldiers, the spectacle turns into entertainment, on which one can even bet a sum of money. All the surrounding soldiers believed that Encrid's rewards were not earned through his efforts, and therefore they believed that a low-ranking soldier could not challenge a middle-ranking one. The main character realized that in front of him was his first opponent, who was the strongest of the middle rank. Someone present took the risk of betting 1 coin on the commander of the 4th detachment. Crace was interested to know who made this bet, but this will only be possible after the winner is determined. Luckily, this fight is almost life-threatening for Encrid, so he only has one chance. The protagonist looked straight ahead and was on guard for the impending attack. In the past, he wouldn't have even dared to challenge most of those gathered here. Despite the frivolity of the battle, he decided to fight as if death itself was in front of him. The opponent swung his sword and warned the hero that he would lose instantly. Encrid noticed that the man's strike reminded him of the one he had mastered during the last battle. The young man managed to find his opponent's blind spot and parry his blow. The enemy's sword flew high into the air, leaving the man unarmed. He shouted at the top of his lungs that his fingers were broken in several places. Then the main character, with particular caution, struck his opponent in the chest. The man lost consciousness and fell to the ground. The main character did not understand why he was given such a weak opponent. It turned out that Crace, who believed in his abilities, had placed his bet on the commander. The young man simply wanted to save face as a commander in front of the public. The hero did not understand why this victory came so easily to him. Those around him believed that the squad leader had won by accident, and that he should not let his feathers fly. One of the men stepped out of the crowd and announced that he was Encrid's second opponent. The protagonist immediately recognized this man, who was part of a heavy infantry detachment. The opponent skillfully spun the tip of the spear to distract Encrid's attention. When the opponent lunged forward, the protagonist immediately cut his spear in half. Encrid immediately realized that the man would strike next with the shaft. But judging by the man's face, this was a finished attack. Without thinking twice, the main character kicked the man in the torso. He fell to the ground, which meant that Encrid had won again. Everyone present, including Encrid's subordinates, reacted strongly to this victory. Everyone was shocked that a low-ranking soldier could easily fight 2 mid-ranking soldiers. Crace asked those present who was willing to place bets on Encrid's next battle. The next opponent was afraid to go out in public and be defeated. Andrew believed that he could easily go to Encrid and challenge him again. However, his comrade believed that Encrid had become much stronger, and even he would have a hard time defeating him now. The men decided not to call themselves heroes and continued to sit silently in the stands. Soldiers approached one of those present and persistently asked him to enter the ring. Rem believed that this man should be the one to go into battle, since he had previously showered the commander with possible insults. This man confessed to the entire public that he was afraid of the main character. Until now, Encrid had to fight with all his might, so he was unable to realize one truth. Earlier, he fought with a sick in the head knight whom he met on the very first day of awakening. After that night, there was a dangerous assassin. Not long ago, Encrid fought Mitch Harrier himself. He also sparred with his subordinates every day. He had to take part in too many difficult fights. His previous fencing teacher told him never to look down on his opponent. The protagonist always thought that this advice would not be useful to him, but he did not know that the day would come when he would consider the enemy a weakling. His expression told those present that he was ready to win any fight. He has become so strong that he can suppress any opponent. A real fight broke out between him and the cowardly man. The main character swung his sword and dealt the man a powerful blow to the head. He instantly fell to the ground and threw away his weapon. His face began to change and the man slowly lost consciousness. The main character was once again able to declare himself as a winner. The enemy had completely lost consciousness, and in his hands was a sword cut into pieces. It was only at this moment that everyone present acknowledged Encrid's past achievements in destroying witchcraft. Andrew rose to his feet and shouted to everyone that before them was a real destroyer of witchcraft. According to him, if it weren't for Encrid, half of the soldiers would have died in that battle. Andrew asked those present to praise the main character with certain chants. All those present shouted as one that they were grateful to the destroyer of witchcraft. Crace approached Encrid and said that he was now a mid-ranking commander. However, the main character decided that he still had to earn a high rank. Crace was surprised that Encrid decided to continue these fights. The conversation between 2 young people was interrupted by the appearance of an important person. On his shoulders were eagle epaulets, which belonged to the border guard of the kingdom. The main character did not understand what the outskirts killer was doing in battles between small detachments. The border guard turned to the main character and asked him to fight him. He adjusted his uniform and was absolutely confident of his victory. Everyone present held their breath, awaiting the fight between Encrid and the outstanding soldier of the highest rank. Even Ram was confident that his commander would not be able to win this battle. The border guard squad is comparable to the Grey Dogs of Aspen, and then Encrid can compete with Mitch himself. The main character himself was interested in what this fight would lead to. The opponent was surprised that the lower-ranking soldier did not cower before him. According to him, Encrid was much more interesting than when he observed him. The entire stand was shouting for Encrid to show what a witchcraft destroyer could do. The men shouted that the infantryman Encrid must win this battle. The man from the special detachment was offended by the fact that no one present knew that he also belonged to the infantry. The next moment, the opponent grabbed his sword and rushed at Encrid. A real fight broke out between them. The man was surprised that his opponent had amazing concentration and balanced movements. However, he was confident that he would knock Encrid off his pedestal. Throwing aside his weapon, he grabbed Encrid by the throat and began to squeeze. The main character swung his sword and wanted to fight off his opponent. However, the protagonist's strike failed and his sword stuck into the ground. This happened because the opponent skillfully maneuvered his body. The man made a perfect lunge forward and struck the Encrid with his sword. Concentrating on one point helped the protagonist grab the sword close to his eyes. After that, he intercepted and grabbed the man by the head. After some fighting, a sword appeared between the two opponents. Having lost his sword, the main character decided to use a small knife. It seemed that the men's strengths were different, but Encrid also had every chance of winning. The company commander Encrida observed what was happening. She intervened in the fight and parried the men's blows. She declared the end of the fight, as one more step could result in the killing of an ally. The main character did not understand what was happening around him and listened to the commander. It turned out that Jackson wanted to kill a man from the special squad. Rem told Encrid's opponent that he was just lucky today. For everyone present, these actions were harsh, because this was an ordinary, simple duel. If the rivals had made it to the end, Encrid would have definitely won. The scout didn't expect anything special from the main character, but now he can't help but admit his victory. Torres extended his hand to Encrid and introduced himself as a junior commander of the border guard detachment. Encrid shook hands with his opponent, and also introduced himself as the commander of the 4th Detachment of the 4th Company. Everyone present shouted that the main character had just risen to the rank of junior commander. They made a fuss and said that Encrid deserved to rise to a high rank. Over the years, Encrid has earned the respect of his subordinates. After this battle, the commander of the Heavy Infantry Detachment offered Encrid to join their company. The Heavy Infantry Squad is the core of the entire division, and if Encrid agrees, he will immediately know the value of this offer. The protagonist bowed carefully and refused the offer. The commander of the Heavy Infantry Detachment realized that the young man would never agree to abandon his company. The protagonist offered to send his subordinate Rem in his place, but the infantry commander refused this weakling. He wanted Encrid to serve with him, since he had saved his life in the previous battle. Crace overheard the conversation between the two commanders, and suggested that Encrid pack his things. The young man believed that his commander would be welcomed with open arms everywhere. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thores, who had previously fought with Encrid. He decided to get straight to the point and also put forward his proposal. This man wanted to see Encrid in his border guard unit. Ram was absolutely sure that his commander would not miss such a chance and would agree to the offer. Thoris clearly sensed after a couple of blows that Encrid was hungry for battle. If the main character joins his squad, Taurus will give him long hours of training and hellish battles. Joining the border guards meant that Encrid would be able to reach the limit of his strength. When Thoris saw the doubts on Encrid's face, he felt hurt. Encrid said that there was no better place for hellish training than this, where he was. Moreover, the main character does not want to reach the limit. His goal is to step over it.